Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories of everyday people and their families. I endeavour to continue publishing episodes ad-free. In order to do so, I would love your support by reviewing my podcast or consider becoming a subscriber for only the cost of a coffee a month. This gives you early access to episodes and also access to bonus episodes, of which at this stage there's over 30. Episode 183, The Lady Prisoners of War. Just a warning, there is some graphic information in this episode relating to war crimes and domestic violence. A Deniliquin local loaned me a CD and it was called The Passing Out Parade, and this was a local production in the Deniliquin and surrounding areas by the Deniliquin Creative Writers Group that told the stories of a range of people that enlisted in conflicts, and I was inspired by one of the stories that was presented on this. Lorna Margaret Whyte was born in Hay, New South Wales on the 19th of April 1915. She was the youngest of 8 children, born to James Whyte and Ada Berthy Guernsey. James Whyte's parents were Scottish and immigrated, no doubt, for the gold rush and settled in Friarstown, Victoria by 1854. James's mother died when he was 14. Ada's paternal grandparents came out to Tasmania under the bounty system in 1843, and Ada's father, Maurice Guernsey, known as Thomas, was born in Hobart in 1849 and emigrated to Victoria by 1857. Thomas married Ada's mother, Mary Jane Caldwell, known as Jane, who was born in Scotland in February 1873 in Sandhurst, now known as Bendigo, the year Ada was born. The problem was she was still married to her first husband, Dennis Egan, who she married in Inglewood, Victoria in 1863 and had 2 girls with him. Thomas Guernsey featured in the Mount Alexander Mail on the 7th of May 1879. Thomas Guernsey of Sandhurst, engine driver, in bankruptcy, liabilities £103, 4 shillings and 8.5 pence, his assets only 5 shillings. The causes of insolvency: want of employment, sickness in the family, death of 2 children, and losses in business as a boarding house keeper. On the 26th of February 1880, in the Mount Alexander Mail, a woman convicted of bigamy. At the Sandhurst Criminal Sessions on Tuesday, Jane Egan, or Jane Guernsey, surrendered to her bail upon the charge of bigamy. The indictment was that on the 14th of February 1873, the prisoner contracted a marriage with Thomas Guernsey, her previous husband being then alive. The case for the prosecution was that the prisoner, whose maiden name was Jane Caldwell, married Dennis Egan in August 1863 at Inglewood. She, while Egan was still alive, married Thomas Guernsey on the 14th of February 1879. The Crown prosecutor said that although the husband could not give evidence against the wife, the reputed second husband was not really the prisoner's husband and could therefore give evidence. Evidence of both marriages was put in, and Thomas Guernsey called as a witness. In cross-examination, he admitted that it was he who prosecuted the prisoner in the first instance and that he had broken her collarbone. He believed it was broken twice by him. The Honour directed the jury to find a verdict of guilty, which they did without leaving the box, but at the same time strongly recommended the prisoner to mercy. Mr McDermott asked to be allowed to make a statement in mitigation of sentence. He went on to say that the prosecution had been initiated purely for vindictive purposes and that no one was injured by the offence of the prisoner, as the prosecution was commenced by a cruel and vindictive man who admitted twice breaking the prisoner's collarbone. His Honour said that the crime was not affected by that. All he heard was that the prisoner had been deserted by her true husband. If she was labouring under the idea that he was dead, she should have found that out before marrying again. And the prisoner was remanded for sentence. So on the 27th of February 1880 in the Bendigo Advertiser, before His Honour Sir Edmund Barry, Jane Egan, otherwise known as Jane Guernsey, convicted of bigamy and was very leniently dealt with, as His Honour thought she'd received quite enough punishment already. His Honour remarked that it was an exceptional case. The prisoner had been treated in a most cruel and dastardly manner by the man Guernsey, and if her case had been brought before the justices, they would no doubt have given her ample compensation and protection. It was scarcely necessary to bind her not to marry a third husband, and the ends of justice would be met by a slight sentence. The sentence of the court was that she be imprisoned until its rising. So on the 27th of February 1880 in the Bendigo Advertiser, it said the case was adjourned of unlawful assault preferred against Thomas Guernsey by Jane Guernsey, and the defendant was allowed on bail with 2 sureties of £20 each. On the 6th of August 1883, in the Bendigo Advertiser in the City Court, a man named Thomas Guernsey was charged with threatening to take the life of his children. His wife did not press the charge, and the defendant was bound over to keep the peace for 6 months in his own recognisance of £25. So after this event, it seems that Thomas Guernsey left the family, and he died at Gunnedah, New South Wales in 1926, aged 76. Jane's brother lived in Hay, New South Wales, and it seems by 1887 that Jane had moved to Hay and she married Harry Shepherd, a blacksmith, although I cannot find a marriage record for them, so it is quite possible that they lived in a de facto relationship. However, Harry Shepherd was charged with assaulting his wife Jane Shepherd with an axe and inflicting grievous bodily harm, and he was arrested in Hay and was committed for trial at the Hay Sessions with a bail allowed for £50 and a surety of £50. As a result, he received 1 month's hard labour in Hay Jail, and he was placed on a good behaviour bond for 12 months, or he would be further imprisoned for 3 months. Jane died in South Hay in August 1901, and there is a memoriam for her that was in the Riverine Grazier, the Hay newspaper, on the 5th of August 1902, in loving remembrance of our dear mother Jane Shepherd, who died on the 3rd of August 1901. Gone from our midst but not forgotten, loving mother, thy image we keep. Never till life's end shall we forget thee. Shine in our hearts in the peace of thy sleep. Inserted by her loving daughters A. and J. Guernsey. In the Hay Riverine Grazier on the 31st of July 1925, says that in Tuesday's Sun it devoted a column to a meeting in Sydney of Harry Shepherd of Hay and T.G. Redmond of Narromburn, Sydney. Both are American Civil War veterans. These two men had lived within 20 miles of each other in Pennsylvania and came to Australia in the same year, although they'd not heard of each other before. It remained for the visit of the American fleet to bring them together. Both men fought at Gettysburg and in many other battles of the war. And it says it may not be generally known that Hay has a resident within its midst that it's had for many years, an American Civil War veteran in the person of Mr. Harry Shepherd of Simpson Street. Mr. Shepherd is 82 years of age and left by this morning's excursion train for Sydney to view the arrival of the Great Fleet from his native land. At the age of 16, he enlisted in the Union Army and was attached to the 142nd Pennsylvania Regiment, Private Company H, and was wounded at the Battle of Fredericksburg on the 13th of December 1862, in which fight his 3 best pals were killed. He also took part in the Great Fight of Gettysburg, the turning point of the memorable conflict. Mr. Shepherd came to Australia in 1870 and settled in Hay in 1879. He was for many years in business as a blacksmith and wheelwright in South Hay. He is a man of wonderful vitality and spends hours at the wood heap or potting around his forge, for which he has never parted. He is a constant reader of the American papers and has a longing to see his native land again, but fears he's now too old to undertake the journey. But says the old veteran, I am not too old to run down to Sydney to have a look at Uncle Sam's family. From the United States government, Mr. Shepherd receives a substantial war pension, which increases as each veteran dies. And in 1932, it said that Harry, at 88 years old, was a veteran of the American Civil War and the only survivor of that great conflict living in New South Wales. So Lorna's parents, Ada Guernsey and James Whyte, married in Hay in 1901. Lorna attended the Hay War Memorial High School before training as a nurse at Corowa Hospital in New South Wales. She joined the Australian Army Nursing Service, and a few weeks before embarkation, Lorna returned to Hay to nurse her father in an illness that proved fatal. And in the Deniliquin Pastoral Times on the 25th of October 1940, it outlines her father's death. Mr. James A. Whyte, who lived in the Hay district for nearly 60 years, died on Saturday, aged 74. A native of Fryestown near Castlemaine, Mr. Whyte went to Hay to see the opening of the railway in 1882. Subsequently, he became a contractor and carried out contracts on stations in all part of the Hay district. He is survived by his wife, 6 daughters and 2 sons. Lorna was one of 6 nurses chosen in April 1941 to go to Rabaul on the island of New Britain, now part of New Guinea, with the 2nd 22nd Battalion in the AIF, which formed the bulk of Lark Force. Rabaul was the peacetime capital of the Australian-mandated territory of New Guinea, having been captured from the Germans in 1914. Lorna travelled on the Wahine, and the women arrived at Rabaul on the 25th of April 1941 to spend the year at the 2nd 10th Australian General Hospital, treating soldiers suffering from tropical diseases. Then the Japanese began dropping bombs. Lorna, in an interview, stated, "All of a sudden they were on top of us. The Australians were taken by surprise." It didn't take long before the first wounded soldiers were brought in for treatment, many requiring amputations. It was traumatic. We didn't have time to think. It was all automatic. Following the bombing of Rabaul on the 4th of January 1942, and almost daily thereafter, the Japanese began their ground invasion of the Australian territory on the 23rd of January 1942. The small Australian garrison, Lark Force, was overwhelmed. 1,050 of its 1,400 troops were captured. Approximately 400 troops escaped to the mainland, while 160 of Australian POWs, including medical orderlies wearing Red Cross brassards, were bayoneted, beheaded, shot or burnt alive by Japanese troops at the Toll Plantation in New Britain. So horrific was the Toll Plantation massacre on the island of New Britain that the Australian government suppressed the details for 47 years. This was a strategically significant defeat of Allied forces by Japan in the Pacific Campaign. Fortunately for Lorna, the night before the invasion, all of the nurses and 80 patients were evacuated by ambulances and cars to the Vinner Pope Catholic Mission Station near Kapoko, joining with the missionaries there. On arrival, they immediately set to work digging trenches. When daylight came, the nurses disbelievingly looked down over the harbour to witness the huge enemy invasion fleet of aircraft carriers, troop ships and submarines. 1,500 Japanese soldiers were landing around the beaches, and surrender was inevitable. Lorna stated that they were fortunate to be under the protection of the bishop at the mission. Polish-born Bishop Sharma had fought in the German army in the Great War and had some influence with the Japanese. Japan had signed a defence alliance agreement in September 1940 with Nazi Germany and Italy, which was largely intended to deter the US from entering the conflict. At first, the Japanese were menacing and the women were warned to always move around in groups. The Japanese were still unaware that they were fully trained nursing sisters. The bishop considered the military patients at the mission a liability, so sent them back to the hospital in Rabaul. This left the 6 AANS nurses and 7 civilian nurses working for the convent, helping to grow food, washing and ironing. They watched the enemy naval ships going out of the harbour and coming back crippled from the Coral Sea battle and in the early days of the Battle of Midway. Lorna says the Japanese soldiers came with guns and bayonets, flipped the boys out of their beds and pushed us around. While they had their machine guns trained on us, the bishop told them the place was actually a German mission. They swallowed it and let us go. The nurses were left at the mission for 5 months. Lorna said there was no contact with the outside world. There were no newspapers, books or letters, and our families thought we were dead. However, life as a POW on Rabaul was quite bearable. They were still in the tropics, so lack of clothing didn't worry us. She said that when they were evacuated from Rabaul to Kapoko, they only had their uniforms, shoes, stockings and a veil. We had 1 set of underclothing each, and they also gave us a sheet each, which we made into clothing. A Japanese military chief came to the mission one day to tell the women that they were being taken to the land of full and plenty. He said there's no mosquitoes there and you'll be well looked after. We thought we were going back to Australia, but we were taken with the 70 Australian officers to the hold of a ship to Japan. And Lorna said so that was what we left Rabaul with, to go to icy Japan. In the Pastoral Times, a Deniliquin paper, it says on the 8th of May 1942, Army sister missing. Sister Lorna Margaret Whyte of Hay is reported missing and is believed to be a prisoner of war. She is the daughter of Mrs. J.A. Whyte of Hay. Sister Whyte was last heard of when at Rabaul. However, a week later, on the 19th of May 1942, in the Hay Riverine Grazier, an article that says Sister Whyte safe. Family receive a letter. The many friends and acquaintances of Sister Lorna Whyte will be pleased to hear that on Saturday last, her mother, Mrs. James Whyte of Simpson Street, Hay, received a 1-page letter from her stating that she was a prisoner of war, was enjoying good health, was being treated well and getting plenty of food. She was still doing hospital work and for that reason was receiving a reasonable amount of freedom. The letter, which was censored, was probably amongst the number dropped by a Japanese plane over Port Moresby on the 28th of April, as announced over the air on Saturday. Lorna states that she's restricted to writing a 1-page letter a month by the Japanese military authorities. The family have not received any definite information about Sister Whyte up to Saturday since the fall of Rabaul. Consequently, it was a great relief to learn of her safety. So on the 6th of June 1942, the 6 nurses, 12 civilian women and 70 POW officers boarded the Naruto Maru, embarked for Yokohama, Japan. They were 8 days at sea, cooped up in the ship's hold with nothing to wash with. Most of the confined passengers would have been totally unaware of the possibility of torpedo attack by Allied submarines. Lorna said we were filthy when we came off the ship. On arrival at Yokohama, Japan, the women were taken by van to a European hotel, where they were surprisingly allowed to bathe, wash their clothes and sit down in style to a decent meal before retiring to comfortable beds with clean sheets. However, this humane treatment only lasted a few days. They were then imprisoned at the Yokohama Boat Club for the next 18 months and forced to knit silk bags and make envelopes. Lorna said in the first year the food was awful but sufficient. In the second year it got worse, and in the end it was non-existent. The women fashioned clothes for themselves with used canvas sails and bamboo needles and ended up eating the glue on envelopes. She said we were doing fewer and fewer envelopes and eating more and more glue. They said we were wasting it. They didn't realise we were eating it. Lorna recalls telling the cook, Fuji-san, that they needed more food to eat, and he'd say, "More? Better you die." I remember watching him cut up cabbage for the guards. He'd cut it in half and throw the core in the rubbish. We'd grab it and put it under our arms, and he'd notice straight away and say, "We're gone, you take." In the end, he threw them out the window and we'd retrieve them at night. Lorna said the Fuji-san had also been selling the nurses' rice rations to his family. The soldiers were later replaced by 2 policemen withdrawn from the army because they had tuberculosis. Lorna said they used to cough all the time. We'd take trays into the room, bow and put them down. When we collected them later, if there was any food left, we'd eat it. 3 girls ended up with TB. She says Fuji-san showed a nicer side at one point when he lent the women a small heater. But one of the guards came in and saw it and threw it into the sea. Fuji-san was furious. Then we were made to stand in line for 2 hours while the guard went up and down slapping our faces and waving his sword around. Lorna describes the policemen as utter lunatics. We called them Coffer and Basher. The women were hit across the back and punched, but fortunately were not raped. We weren't their type, she says. They never broke our spirit. We always had hope and knew we'd get out one day. There was no kitchen, bathroom or privacy. Embarrassingly, they often had to use the open squat toilets in front of the policemen using the urinals. Food was delivered by bike. Sometimes it was contaminated when it fell off the bicycle onto the road and was repacked by the rider. At one point she remembers looking through the hole in a palisade and seeing a ship in the harbour with a white cross on it. We were positive we were going to be exchanged, but they took us on a truck in the other direction towards Mount Fuji. There were so many disappointments. They came and they went. The nurses were taken to a former TB clinic on a hill at Totsuka to work as slave labourers for the Japanese villagers, digging stumps and sweeping snow. They survived in sub-zero temperatures with no running water and only 2 futons each. Lorna said we had them for 3 years and they never saw a washing machine. We were working in fields with human manure and our duvets could have stood up. They were so stiff with dirt. They washed in a bucket of water after breaking the ice. If you wanted to bathe, you threw the freezing water over you. Lorna said that the last 6 months in Japan were the worst. Not only were they all hungry, but severely suffering from the cold during one of the worst winters experienced in 30 years. Snow was on the ground. We had no running water, no fires and no warmth of any kind, no shoes and socks. We worked outside barefoot. At night they huddled together to keep warm, even though Kel, one of their roommates, had TB very badly. They always risked getting TB, but they were too hungry to care. They knitted jumpers for children and told the Japanese mothers each would take 6 balls of wool when they knew it would only take 4. We lived by our wits. One day the guards ordered the women to walk down the hill. We thought those bastards wanted us to lift stuff up the hill. We were in a weakened state. They marched us down, our feet wrapped in rags. But a pleasant surprise awaited them in the form of a Red Cross parcel with tea, cocoa, butter and cigarettes. They were careful to make it last. We added half a spoon of sugar and half a spoon of powdered milk to our bowl of rice. It made such a difference, it was like heaven. On the 1st of September 1942, in the Riverine Grazier, the Hay newspaper, it says, another old resident of the town, Mrs. Ada Whyte, widow of the late James A. Whyte, died on Saturday after a painful illness. She was a native of Bendigo and 68 years of age and had been a resident of Hay for 55 years, coming to Hay with her mother and two sisters. She was married to Mr. Whyte in 1901 and made her home here. Mrs. Whyte has been in failing health for about a year as a result of an internal malady, and she's worried about the fate of her daughter, Sister Lorna Whyte, who is captive of the Japanese in New Guinea. So, unfortunately for Lorna, she was unaware at this time that her mother had passed away. From March 1945, the nurses could see the US B-29 aircraft firebombing Tokyo, but were too far away to even know about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were not told that the war was over, but sensed it when things suddenly began to improve. They were also unaware that orders had been issued by the Japanese military to execute all POWs if the Allies landed on the Japanese mainland. Lorna gave a chilling account of this. She said the Japanese got us to enlarge one of the air raid shelters. They said, "For you, for you." We had a very old guard called Papa-san. He was really a kind old Japanese man, very good to us girls. He came just after we'd dug this big air raid shelter, and he said in broken Japanese and English, "I have grown very fond of you girls. I am going to be asked to do something that I don't want to do, so I have decided that they will give me a position in Tokyo and I am going there." This air raid shelter was our own grave we'd been digging. Lorna has vivid memories of the firebombing of Tokyo. The heavy bombers flew over them to drop their deadly incendiaries, which killed 100,000 people. More than 70,000 were killed by the Hiroshima atomic bomb in August that same year. She said, "We sat on windowsills and watched. The sounds of sirens went on for half an hour before more than 1,000 bombers flew across in waves. It was like daylight. There was so much light in the sky. It was one of the worst things anyone could see." The Japanese weren't prepared for the bombing and didn't have underground shelters. Women were running in the streets with babies burning on their backs, and thousands ran into the river. It was packed with bodies floating out to sea. After the raids, Japanese civilian corpses were stacked on top of each other in the graveyard, and family members laid rice balls on them to appease their spirits. The nurses crept in at night and ate the rice balls despite the putrid smell. Lorna said, "We tried to get them before the rabbits. We decided that the spirits that were alive deserved them more." Lorna said, "We weren't close enough to see the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima or know anything about it, but early the next morning one of the guards came yelling and screaming, 'Parkinson, Parkinson,' and Matron K. Parker ran down and said, 'Now what do you want?' And the guard said, 'America, no good, no good, one bomb, Hiroshima, all gone, all gone.' And Kay said, 'I wouldn't worry about that. They've got plenty more of those up their sleeve.' The guard went away disgusted. On Friday the 10th of August 1945, it was reported in Hayes Riverine Grazier newspaper that the sisters of Lieutenant Lorna Whyte, AANS, this week received from the Minister for the Army the following telegram. "It is with pleasure I have to inform you, London advises that Swiss Minister in Tokyo, through British legation at Bern, reports that Lieutenant Lorna Margaret Whyte, previously reported missing, believed prisoner of war, is now reported prisoner of war, interned at Totsuka, Japan, and in good health." So this was the first news that the family had received in 3 years. The nurses overheard the Japanese Emperor's surrender speech on the radio, but it wasn't until American soldiers visited that they knew the war was really over. She said, "We'd never seen Americans before. We didn't know who they were. We'd never seen jeeps." And they were actually found by accident because General MacArthur's troops were on their march into Tokyo. The emaciated women celebrated by eating a large lump of meat, but their digestive systems were so damaged that it caused diarrhea. They were quickly flown to Manila, where they stayed for a month, being fed, tested and detoxed. And in the Hay Riverine Grazier on the 4th of September 1945, Sister Lorna Whyte liberated 18 Australian girls coming home from Japan. In Tokyo, Sister Lorna Whyte of Hay, one of the 18 Australian nurses released from a Japanese prison camp known as Totsuka, about 12 miles southwest of Yokohama. They left Yokohama on Saturday for Manila and will be sent to Australia as soon as possible. The nurses included 6 from the Australian Army, 4 who before the war had served in the Methodist Mission hospitals in New Guinea, and 8 others who were associated with the New Guinea Civil Administration hospitals. The nurses said that they were kept at Yokohama Bund Hotel for a while, and then the Yokohama Yacht Club, where they remained until July last year. They were then removed to a camp outside Totsuka. They said the diet was not bad until early 1943 when it was reduced to scanty supplies of Japanese food, mostly carrot top soup and a little rice and barley. As a result of this, they lost on average 35 pounds in weight. The nurses said they had received Christmas parcels in 1942 from the British Red Cross and in 1943 from the American Red Cross. They also received parcels in June last year and one in October. By this time, all were suffering from beriberi and most had contracted malaria. Last Christmas, they received 9 US Red Cross parcels, and these literally saved their lives. The nurses said they lived 4 to a room and first had to sleep on straw mattresses on the floor, but permission was later given to raise these on boxes. Nearby peasants had been friendly and they bartered cigarettes for food, but such barter was strictly forbidden and they would have been severely punished had it been discovered. In an interview with a correspondent, Sister Whyte said, "We had a wonderful view of the air raids, which used to terrorise the guards, who were greatly impressed when we would stand up and yell, 'Drop some more.' We told the guards that if they were good Japs, they would not get hit. One girl was thrown on the floor and almost kicked to pieces, and even the cook was allowed to crack us, but mostly we were not treated too roughly. One guard got so mad at me that he took off his gloves and stood on tiptoes to slap me, and it was awfully hard not to laugh. Another time, when we shivered through the winter, the same guard kept repeating angrily, 'Japan is hot.' Our captors were delirious when they told us that President Roosevelt had been killed by a Jap bomb. Our worst experience was when our rations were so short that we used to take turns to steal food left on the plates of the guards. A month ago, all we had to eat were boiled carrots and greens, but my word, how the food improved in the last fortnight." Miss Lorna Whyte is the youngest daughter of the late Mr. and Mrs. James Whyte of Hay. She's a native of the town and was educated at the Hay War Memorial High School. She undertook her nursing training at Corowa and enlisted at Cabarrusha Private Hospital, Castle Craig, and she sailed on her 26th birthday. She was sent to Rabaul with her AANS. She was taken in with the fall of that area. For 3.5 years, she's been listed as missing believed prisoner of war. Recently, her designation was officially altered to prisoner of war, and her sisters had a cable from her advising them that she was safe. Up until this paper went to press, they had not officially been advised of her liberation. And in the Perth Daily News, on the 14th of September 1945, nurses make light of their sufferings. 16 repatriated Australian nurses arrived in Sydney at Mascot Aerodrome last night. Physically weak and mentally weary from their hardships of 3.5 years imprisonment, they nevertheless had painted their nails, rouged and powdered their faces, and brought earrings and brooches in Manila to spare their families the shock of their appearance. Sister Lorna Whyte reassured her family that nothing that has happened matters. "I'm home now." But despite the brave smiles, all of the nurses were nervy, pale and weak. Because they were given no soap to wash with, 4 nurses shaved their heads. Each nurse was presented with a lovely bouquet, given ration books and 200 extra clothing coupons, and were allowed to draw against back pay to meet immediate demands. They returned to Australia on the 25th of September 1945. They said, "We had lots to learn. We were out of the world for 4 years and are coming back to a strange place." For many years, nobody was aware that these women were alive and incarcerated in Japan. Lorna's mother died while she was away, and her family home had been removed. Her sisters, brothers and friends had abandoned all hopes for her safety. She said it was a wonderful time coming home, but it was also very hard. In 1947, the Australian government recognised Lorna in a mention in the Dispatches Award for holding the hospital at Vinnipope together. And on the 20th of February 1948, it was announced with the War Office, the King has been graciously pleased, on the advice of his Australian ministers, to approve the following as mentioned in recognition of their gallant and distinguished services whilst prisoner of war in Japanese hands prior to September 1945. And there's 4 nurses listed, and Lieutenant Lorna Margaret Whyte is one of them. In 1948, Lorna decided she wanted to experience the world and planned a trip to the US with a friend. En route to America, though, she became sick and had to stay in hospital in New Zealand. She stayed in a private nurses' hospital in Auckland and spent 6 months in hospital. Her body became stiff and she couldn't move, so her legs were put in splints. Doctors thought she had polio, but healthy doses of sunlight and fresh air helped make a full recovery. Once she was well, she married Bill Johnston, a Kiwi who served in the New Zealand 18th Battalion. They had 3 daughters, and Lorna worked with children with physical disabilities. Bill died in 1980. In 1992, Lorna was awarded a Queen's Service Order Medal for 14 years of work with children with disabilities at Mount Roskill School. Her story and that of another Australian nurse, Sister Berenice Twohill, were made into a telemovie, Sisters of War, based on Rod Miller's transcript, The Lost Women of Rabaul. Lorna makes a guest appearance at the end of the film. In November 2011, aged 96, Lorna was nominated to take part in a Japanese-organised Prisoners of War program, and she was one of 5 POWs invited. She was the only survivor of a group of 76 Australian POW nurses. She took a 10-day trip with her daughter Patricia. She met government leaders and visited places of special significance, and here she received an official apology from the Japanese government. Despite an apology coming so late, she was amazingly gracious and eloquent and showed no shred of bitterness. Far from being anxious about the experience, Lorna said she was looking forward to it. She said, "I'm going to enjoy it. I'm not carrying any baggage. I've put it behind me. They're going to so much trouble to be friends. I think we should reciprocate and make peace." She flew business class and stayed in nice hotels, which was a far cry from the filthy, deprived conditions she encountered on her last visit. When she returned home to Auckland, she was visited by Australian artist Peter Wegner, who painted her portrait, and it featured in an exhibition at the Melbourne Shrine of Remembrance. Lorna died peacefully at Auckland Hospital, surrounded by her family, on the 30th of September 2013 at the age of 98. An avar was written for Lorna. Lorna Johnston, an outstanding Australian who inspired so many with her courage and joy for life. As an army nurse, Lorna was taken prisoner by the Japanese in January 1942 at Kapoko, East New Britain, Papua New Guinea, and endured over 3 years' captivity in Japan. A true Australian, Lorna's spirit of forgiveness was heartfelt. She was a generous supporter of the Rabaul and Montevideo Maroon Memorial from the start, always remembering those who had been in Rabaul with her. Along with Sister Berenice Twohill, Lorna inspired the ABC telemovie Sisters of War. What a tremendous ambassador for Australia. Her grace and dignity always shone through, and her profound inspirational influence on her POW colleagues remained steadfast throughout this traumatic period and beyond. And Lorna is epitomised on the Haywater Tower. And just a small note on Sister Berenice Twohill. Sister Berenice was born Mary Dimpner Twohill in 1919 at Murwillumbah in New South Wales. She was the 8th child of 11, and she was the first girl after 7 boys, born to Alexander Edward Twohill and Eliza Kenny, who were both of mainly Irish descent. The family farmed at Tumblegum near Murwillumbah. The Twohill family was very happy and close-knit and a very devout Catholic family. Her father was an early member of the Knights of the Southern Cross and of the Hibernian Society. He was president of the Tweed Shire for many years and inspired his family with an interest in politics as a way of improving society. Dimpner received her education from the Sisters of St. Joseph's, with whom she boarded for many years, and it was from the sisters that she learnt about devotion to Our Lady of the Sacred Heart. At a young age, she felt the call to serve God as a missionary, and at 17 and a half, she wrote to Mother Mary Concepta to apply for admission to the Congregation of the Daughters of Our Lady of the Sacred Heart. She gained her interest in the missions from her grandmother, who worked much for the church and the African missions. After finishing school, Dimpner taught for 1 year with the Sisters of St. Joseph's. At this time, she loved the social life introduced to her by her brothers. She enjoyed dancing and sport, tennis, running, jumping and swimming so much that she tried to forget her earlier desire to become religious. But Dimpner did enter the Congregation of the Daughters of Our Lady of the Sacred Heart at Bowral on the 31st of May 1934 and was given the name Sister Mary Berenice. She was professed on the 6th of January 1936. Because she studied music before she entered the convent, from the time of her profession she was a music teacher. After a year in Kensington, she transferred to the old St. Bernard's School of Botany, and in 1939 went to teach music at Bowraville on the north coast. Here she also helped Sister Mary Bernard Hoy as a teacher in her school for Aboriginal children. At Bowraville, she left on her missionary journey to the island of New Britain, where she taught in Rabaul at St. Joseph's School for Children. Not long after her arrival, World War II broke out, and Sister Mary Berenice and other sisters of her community, together with the missionary of the Sacred Heart Priests and Brothers and the missionary of the Sacred Heart Sisters, were taken prisoner by the Japanese. They were released at the end of the war after 3 years and 7 months of imprisonment. Sister Mary Berenice's health did not permit her to return to Rabaul, and so for the rest of her life she taught music in Bentley, Elmore, Queenstown, Alice Springs, Corinda, Kensington, Daceyville, Botany, Mascot and Barrel. It was at Barrel that she taught Vietnamese boys who had come as refugees on boats. What she loved was also parish work, visiting the people who needed help in their homes and preparing children for their sacraments. Sister Berenice's experience in the war was slightly different to Lorna's. While Lorna eventually was transferred with other Australian nurses to prison camps in Japan, Sister Berenice and fellow nuns finished the war living under Japanese guard in jungle caves at a primitive camp called Ramal behind Rabaul on New Britain. Sister Berenice's mother died on the 23rd of May 1944 while she was in Rabaul, so she was similar to Lorna, where unfortunately her mother passed away while she was a POW. And there's Australian War Memorial photo, and it says on the 16th of September 1945, sisters and priests boarding an army barge for transfer to the motor launch Gloria, being evacuated from the mission in Ramal Valley to Rabaul. Contact with the internees was made by Allied troops and representatives of the Australian Red Cross following the surrender of the Japanese. And Sister Berenice is in the foreground of that photo. On the 12th of September 1945 in the Murwillumbah Tweed Daily, it announces that Sister Berenice was safe and well. Word was received yesterday by Mr. A.E. Twohill of Tumblegum that his daughter, Dimpna, who is Sister M. Berenice, was captured in Rabaul, New Britain, but is safe and well. This is the first word of Sister Berenice since the 26th of December 1941. And in the Sydney Catholic Weekly, on the 13th of September 1945, talks about Sister Berenice and her fellow nuns. Interned Australian nuns safe, many religious named at a New Britain prison camp. The surrender of the Japanese forces to Lieutenant General Sturds at Rabaul on the 6th of September resulted in the immediate release of large numbers of Catholic ministry priests, brothers and nuns who have been held prisoner in New Britain for upwards of 3 years. Already it is known that all of the Australian nuns who were members of the Congregation of Our Lady of the Sacred Heart and who were working in New Britain when the Japanese escaped the island are alive. No word of some of them has been received since their internment, but according to the Japanese commander, they are at Ramal prison camp and are generally in good health. When surrender negotiations were being discussed with the Japanese representatives, a list of civilian internees was handed to Australian authorities. It was made available to the Catholic Weekly by the Army Department's Directorate of Public Relations, and a close check was made with the various religious orders whose members had been serving in the Solomon Islands and New Britain. The checkup revealed that 10 Australian and 2 Irish nuns, together with their superior, Reverend Mother Johanna Conders, were included on the list. And it mentions Sister M. Berenice Twohill of Tumblegum, New South Wales. And on the 16th of September 1945 in the Brisbane Sunday Mail, 10 Australian nuns at Rabaul camp. 10 Australian nuns located at the internment camp outside Rabaul are all members of the Order of Our Lady of the Sacred Heart with headquarters at Kensington, Sydney. All were attached to Vunapope Mission, and they included Sister M.O. Berenice, relative A.E. Toomill, Tumblegum, Tweed River, New South Wales. And in the Sydney Sun on the 16th of September 1945, missionary, 10 nuns safe near Rabaul. Reverend J. Benson of the Australian Board of Missions, thought to have been murdered by the Japanese at Boona, New Guinea, and 10 Australian nuns have been found alive and well. They have been found by an Anglo party among civilian internees in Ramal Valley, New Britain, and have been brought into Rabaul. When Major General K.W. Ether visited the camp, the internees hoisted an Australian flag made by the nuns. The nuns said the Japanese had not molested them, but had often asked them where their husbands were living. And in an interview with Sister Berenice, she said, "When we were rescued, we went mad. They asked us what we wanted, and I told them that I would just die for a cup of tea." Courage, self-sacrifice, forgiveness, self-reliance, and the ability to catch and eat rats, feral cats and snakes were just few of the traits that Sister Berenice acquired during her 3.5-year internment. Giving up her rations to feed the wounded soldiers was one of the ways of fighting back and having some control under incredibly difficult circumstances. Sister Mary Berenice worked at the Marion Centre and spent time at Canna, a drop-in centre in nearby Surrey Hills for homeless and street people. She also carried on in the chapel known as the Cenacle when people gathered to pray specially for priests. Sister Berenice said she holds no grudges against the Japanese, as she's well aware of the fact that whatever was happening to them in their internment camp was also occurring in many other countries, including her own. Lorna and Sister Berenice met in 1997, and there's a lovely photo of them that I'll put on the Facebook page. On the 15th of January 2016, Sister Berenice celebrated 80 years as the daughter of Our Lady of Sacred Heart and was 99 at the time of the celebration of her 80-year service to the church. And in a 2003 interview for the Australians at War Film Archive, she reflected on her time in captivity, and she said that she witnessed wartime atrocities carried out by Japanese troops. We saw the torture ourselves. We saw what they did. It was terrible. There was not a thing you could do, just not a thing. You just had to watch it. Sister Berenice died on the 3rd of November 2017, aged 100, only 6 days shy of turning 101. So I'm recording this today on Anzac Day, and I think what a most fitting tribute to these two wonderful women who gave service in both the religious and medical ways and suffered through being prisoners of war. What a great legacy they have given us. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch.